My name's Brett McLeod. I'm a journalist with the Nine Network. I've had some experience in going into war zones such as Iraq and Afghanistan and Lebanon and others, but my experience is nothing like the sorts of journalists we're going to be hearing about tonight. The concept of war reporter is relatively new. We've got writings about war, of course, going back millennia, but to have an independent observer of war has really only been around a couple of centuries. At St Paul's Cathedral, there's a plaque marking the final resting place of William Howard Russell. He was a journalist for the Times of London, and the epitaph states he was the first and greatest war correspondent. It's debatable on both counts, but certainly he was the first civilian specifically sent by a journal to go and report on battle. Prior to that, war reporting had been largely an incidental part of a foreign correspondent's life. A lot of it was second-hand information gleaned from letters, or occasionally letters were requested by newspapers to be sent by officers in the field, which of course were of dubious independence. The story that launched Russell to fame, the copy he wrote, started with this. At 10 minutes past 11, our light, sorry, here we go. At 10 minutes past 11, our light cavalry advanced. At 35 minutes past 11, not a British soldier except the dead and dying was left in front of the Muscovite guns. Of course, he was talking about the charge of the Light Brigade. And his articles for their day were unflinching in their account of war. Brutal, bloody, and in this case a failed charge, it was always doomed to failure. And the public loved it. His reports were a hit. Russell became a star. He was feted by the public, by generals, by prime ministers alike. If he was alive today, he would have been clickbait. And the public was desperate to find out what war was really like. And this is closer to it than anything they'd seen before. He became the first acknowledged war correspondent. Although he preferred to call it this way, quote, he was the miserable parent of a luckless tribe. That was in 1854. 5 years later, when the American Civil War broke out, there were 500 members of that tribe covering that conflict. Russell was also said to be deeply insecure, vain, requiring constant praise to keep him working, so some things also haven't changed. Since then, reporters have been involved in every significant conflict. Although in fact the wheels turned again because there's a conflict going on right now with virtually no outside reporters covering it for different reasons, and that's of course what's happening in Syria. We may get to that. So many of those who helped forge a path for the rest of us came from right here in Victoria. They're either born here or they end up calling Victoria home. So we're going to have a listen tonight about who they were from three of our guests, and then have a Q&A. We'd like you to be involved too on war reporting. Well, we have a sneak preview of this fantastic space. Gary Hutchinson has authored and edited over 30 books, including Remember Them, a guide to Victoria's wartime heritage. He's passionate in this particular area. Mark Baker is a former managing editor, national of Fairfax Metro Media, senior editor of The Age and Canberra Times. Spent more than 13 years as a correspondent in Asia, including covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is a former political editor and Canberra Bureau Chief of The Age. Tony Walker is international editor for the Australian Financial Review, former Washington and China correspondent who's reported extensively on and from the Middle East, and is on the board of the C.E.W. Bean Foundation, which we'll hear about tonight. Can you make our guests welcome? And roughly we're going to be looking at First World War, Second World War, and a bit of a look back at things currently in a reflective way. So Mark, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Brett. 2 weeks ago, the Melbourne Press Club had the third and foundation dinner for the establishment of the Australian Media Hall of Fame. At the same time, we published a book to acknowledge the 81 foundation inductees of the Hall of Fame. And if you look at those characters, and there are books outside which are available, and I'm not here to plug books. One of the most powerful things you see is what an outstanding contribution journalists who came from Victoria or who were very closely associated with Victoria throughout their careers have made to the coverage of war in recent history. I mean in the last 200 years or so, 150, 200 years. And I'd like to talk particularly tonight about the First World War. Gary will and Tony will talk about other aspects. But prior to the First World War, Victoria produced a journalist of particular distinction. William Lambie worked for the Age newspaper. Now, William Lambie had the dubious honour of being the first Australian correspondent to be wounded in action, and subsequently to be the first Australian correspondent to be killed in action. Lambie accompanied the New South Wales contingent that went to the Sudan to avenge the death of General Gordon. He was shot while riding to file his dispatch after a skirmish. Subsequently, he went to the Boer War and he was killed very early in 1900 in a Boer ambush. I believe he is believed to have been the first Australian indeed who was killed in the Boer War. The First World War clearly changed things very dramatically for the coverage of correspondence. Up until that point, correspondents had been able to range quite freely, covering conflicts, Western journalists I mean in particular, and to be able to move from one side to the other and to have a status which gave them a very high degree of protection. And as I say, a great degree of independence. Once the First World War arrived, suddenly we met with censorship and the controls. The First World War indeed was the first time in which governments, and particularly in the case of the British government, moved very decisively to control the activities of journalists for obvious reasons in terms of their desire to maintain confidentiality and the control. And of course everything we've seen that's happened in terms of censorship and media control and media manipulation by armies and governments has stemmed from that. Victoria in the First World War made a particular contribution. Two of the most famous or most important figures in terms of the coverage of the war came from Victoria. One, of course, was Sir Keith Murdoch, who's hugely famous for his role in the letter which he carried to London and which led ultimately, or was a contributing factor ultimately, to the abandonment of the Gallipoli campaign. Another journalist who I think played a particularly important role, but is far less known today, excuse me, was Philip Schuler, who was the correspondent for the Age newspaper. When Australia went to war, there was only one official correspondent. There was a ballot in the Journalists' Union. That ballot was won by Charles Bean, who of course went on to cover the war from start to finish and ultimately to write a large part of the history and indeed to play a pivotal role in the establishment of the War Memorial in Canberra. Keith Murdoch was runner-up in that ballot. Philip Schuler was sent by the Age without formal accreditation. He was accepted to travel with the first convoy, and he travelled on the same ship as Bean, and they became quite close and maintained a close relationship from there on. He couldn't get to the landings, Schuler, but eventually he persuaded Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander, to give him permission to go ashore. He got ashore by late July and was there for the August offensives and saw and reported very impressively on those incredible battles in that period. Schuler came home and after that and wrote the first book to be published about the Gallipoli campaign, an important book, Australia in Arms, which was recently republished by Penguin. He could then have, and his work was very well received. He was regarded by many as a far better writer and a more effective correspondent than Bean had been at that point. He would have had an armchair ride to cover the war in France and the Western Front, but instead he chose to enlist as a private soldier. He refused a commission, although he'd been an officer in the militia before the war, and went as a driver in Monash's divisional train. Ultimately, he was killed in June of 1917 after the Battle of Messines. I have a particular interest in Schuler. I'm writing a book about him, but his work I think was important, and he was a key contributor to the legend that persists and the popular perceptions in Australia of what happened at Gallipoli and thereafter. So two very important figures out of Victoria and in different ways made a great contribution to what we know.
Thanks, Mark. Gary?
Just picking up on one thing that Mark said, and that is censorship and the relationship between journalists and military, their military overseers.
Gary, you might need to grab that microphone.
Oh, sorry, I'll do. Oh, sorry. I've got the person I'm thinking particularly of is the relationship between Ken Slessor and General Blamey, commander of the. I don't know whether we can count Ken as a Victorian, can we?
No.
Just for 1 second.
We won't for this purpose.
Tonight we can.
So he, of course, got into trouble with a report that he'd made. They had a number of semi-official accredited correspondents in the Second World War, and Ken was one. Osmar White, another one. Damien Pera, we can't count him as a Victorian either.
Yes, we do.
Can we?
Yes. He's in the Victorian Media Hall of Fame. He must
All right,
be
that's good enough for me. Family came from Tasmania, but we'll leave that aside. They were great people, the Peras. Before the Second World War, Damien's dad had the pub at Wow, up in the highlands of New Guinea, and a nephew was the person who came last in the 1919 London to Melbourne air race. His name was Ray Pera, known as Battling Pera. It took him about 9 weeks to get here. Anyway, Pera's dad had the pub in Wow, and Pera and Ozzy White had before Kokoda had walked the Bulldog track, which is even tougher than the Kokoda track, up to Wow, which is to the east. What am I saying? To the west of Kokoda, and got there to find the Japanese had bombed or shelled the place, and the pub was destroyed, and the bank was gone. They tried to open the bank vault, couldn't get in there. But they found Damien found in the ruins of the Wow pub, because parents had got out before the war, earlier in the war, he'd found a raffia camel, like the ones you used to pick up on souvenirs in Port Said, which he'd sent to his mum, back from North Africa. I thought that was a bit sad, really, that he found that. Of course, Pera got into trouble as well as Slessor with authorities, and both of them ended up working for, Slessor for the ABC. This is and Pera for Movie Time.
United
Movie Time News. Yeah. So there's always a tension between what journalists wanted to write and what they were permitted to write, and it was, a lot of Bean's stuff in the First World War suffered for that particular reason. Other great Victorians, Alan Moorhead. I love Alan Moorhead. We all love Alan Moorhead. I love the fact that the way he got going in journalism was he had this for the Herald he was at the university, and he provided the end of year results. This has got nothing to do with war, but it's the way journalists get going. And he they posted on the notice board the results, and so he took them down, and he was getting a penny a line or something in the Herald for these things, and he hadn't realised that they weren't going to run them on, they were going to run them person by person, so he got a whole lot of pennies, and that more or less financed his trip to Spain in the first place to get his first job. So I have a prop. Trouble with censorship and not that one, this one. I have here my uncle's official hat. There you go. Can you see? He's got a smaller head than me. So this is the cap worn by Lawrence Turner, who was, it says up there, press correspondent, and I've got the badge somewhere.
He definitely is.
Because he was embedded. He was the first journalist, to my knowledge, who was actually embedded. He was embedded with 2 Royal Australian Regiment in the Malayan emergency in 1955-56, and this is what they wore: Australian press correspondent. And there was a big kerfuffle. Uncle Lawrence worked for the Herald, and there was one other one working for the Age and associated publications. They wanted to be called war correspondents, but no, we weren't officially at war with the terrorists or insurgents or whatever they were in the north of Malaya at the time, so they had to cut, originally they had to cut the war off their badges, and they just were, for a time until they made new ones, Australian correspondents, not war correspondents. So the Herald, so he was there, and in 55-56 covered what there was to cover. To RAR found very little evidence of the terrorists. They chased them through the jungle, couldn't find any, very much. A few people wounded. A number of the soldiers were killed, but he was embedded in that, and his main problem was not being censored, but finding enough to write about. So there's a big difference between some of the experiences of the Second World War guys and things that followed. Of course, Korea was another one, you know, Vietnam and so on, with all sorts of different experiences of people there. So I'll finish with a reference to, I mentioned Osmo White and Damien Pear on the Bulldog track. Slessor and Moorhead were in North Africa, and I think the other thing about them is that they all wrote, the best book about the New Guinea campaign is Osmo White's Green Armour. The best book about Tobruk is Chester Wilmot's Tobruk, and Alan Moorhead's North African trilogy is just absolutely great. A last story about being a war correspondent. Moorhead is with the Charles de Gaulle, and he's getting through the Normandy landings, and he ends up goes to Paris, and you know, what do you do when you get to Paris? It's liberated, or you go and stay, what hotel will you stay in? Well, he wanted to go and stay in the Crillon, but it was full, and so they were sent off to the Hotel Scribe, and there was this bloke in there drinking champagne. He got there first, and he said, was alleged to have said to Moorhead, well, you Aussies are always late. And it was Ernest Hemingway who'd been there drinking for, you know, several weeks before him. So, that's it.
Gary, thank you. Tony, you've got an area of this which is of particular interest to you.
Yeah, I'm going to have the...
Oh, you better have that.
Can I have that?
Oh, of course you can.
Well, so much has been mentioned that triggers memories for me and thoughts and things that I would like to say, but I'm going to contain this to just 3 or 4 topics, one of which is our attempts to raise funds to build a memorial in the War Memorial Precinct to Australian war correspondents, who I think we can agree have made a huge contribution to national identity. The mention's been made of this book that has been produced by the Melbourne Press Club, and I think it's a really excellent piece of work, and I'm really proud to have been associated with it. I'd forgotten, but I actually wrote 4 chapters. Did anyone write any more? And I wrote
It's the record,
chapters on...
John, equal record.
George Morrison, Alan Moorhead, Noel Monks, and the fourth name just eludes me, Dennis Warner.
Yes.
Noel Monks, of course, was the first into Guernica after it was bombed, and his accounts stand the test of time. Alan Moorhead's name has been mentioned on more than one occasion this evening, and I think there's, at least from my perspective, there's absolutely no doubt that Alan Moorhead was the greatest war correspondent in this country's history. He's a hero of mine. He doesn't get sufficient credit, in my opinion, for helping to revive the Gallipoli story. I think his book Gallipoli, and respectfully to Les, who couldn't be with us tonight, Les Carline, I'm not making a comparison between the two. Both are prodigious, excellent pieces of work. But Moorhead should be given credit for helping to revive the Gallipoli story. And I'm not going to use the word myth here. He went to Gallipoli in 1955 on assignment for the New Yorker and wrote an account of that visit, which resonated with some of his fellow Australians who were holidaying in the Greek islands at the time. He helped inspire George Johnson's book, My Brother Jack, and he also helped inspire Sidney Nolan's Gallipoli series. And he wrote his book. Moorhead arrived in Gallipoli as a skeptic and left a convert. I think, like many Australians, he thought that the whole Gallipoli story had been overdone. I think people had felt that the Anzac Day celebrations had turned into something that was regarded by people, I think, as a bit excessive, perhaps a bit distasteful. But Moorhead's book, I think, and his account of his visit to Gallipoli helped to shift opinion, and he should be given credit for that. I want to talk about Charles Bean and John Monash just briefly. There have been, I think, there has been some tendency to try and elevate Monash, perhaps somewhat at the expense of Charles Bean. Let's agree that they were both very great Australians. What Bean committed to his own personal diary was inappropriate, obviously. And I'm not going to use the word but here. However, their contributions to this country, I think, should be recognised, and one should not be used to diminish the other. Which brings me to another controversial subject, which is the move underway at present to try and elevate John Monash to rank posthumously of Field Marshal. This country has had one too many field marshals, quite frankly. Thomas Blamey was mentioned before. Why Menzies chose to elevate Blamey to the rank of Field Marshal is not entirely clear to me. From a journalist point of view, Blamey was, how can I put it, he doesn't rank highly in our estimation, quite frankly. He drove Chester Wilmot out of New Guinea, and Damien Parra and others, and of course Wilmot went on to Europe and made his name. Parra worked for the American News Agency and was killed in the Pacific. But as far as Monash is concerned, anyone who's read Roland Perry's book would agree this was a great citizen-soldier story, and in no way am I trying to diminish his contribution. But I think if he is to be elevated to Field Marshal, there are others who might also be elevated, including Chevelle, Birdwood, and Brudenell White. Now, as far as Charles Bean is concerned, he was, as Mark mentioned, the author of 6 of the war histories. He edited the rest. It was a prodigious effort. It was a life's work. He was also the inspiration or one of the inspirations behind the establishment of the War Memorial. You could argue that War Memorial may not have been built as quickly and in the form in which it was built if it was not for Charles Bean. He envisaged it as a museum as much as a memorial and a centre for research and scholarship, and that's what it's become. And I think it's the most visited tourist site in our country, and certainly most visited commemorative site. Now, as far as our own efforts to raise money for a war memorial, a memorial to correspondence in the War Memorial Precinct, this has been hard going, I should tell you. We need $600,000 to build the memorial, which is, you probably can't see this, or you won't be able to see it, but it's just to describe it to you. We ran a competition, and the winners were actually the architects who designed the new Parliament House. And I think they came up with a terrific concept. Here in the centre is an oculus, which will be made out of polished South Australian granite, which will be reflective, so you'll be able to see reflected in this oculus the surroundings, and including the memorial itself. That's going to cost $120,000, $130,000 for just that piece of South Australian granite. And then into the little hill at the western end of the sculpture garden in the War Memorial, we're going to set a sandstone bench so people can sit there and reflect and look across to the Hall of Memories. And then behind you can see there's a sort of landscaping that may remind people of Vietnam or paddy fields or something like that. But the idea of this is to acknowledge not just the writers who have been mentioned tonight, but of course the photographers like Damien Parra, the war artists, and people tend to forget that the tradition of war artistry that we have in this country. Will Dyson, Streeton was a war artist, Roberts was a war artist, Dargy was, and on and on and on, and of course cine cameramen like Neil Davis, who gave his life in Bangkok. So I've got 5 copies of this brochure. Anyone wants a copy and wants to make a contribution, you're most welcome. Thanks very much.
Good, Tony, thank you. Please thank each of our speakers. And at the moment I'll ask you to have any questions you want to put to me, but I get to go first. And let me preface this by saying this will seem like an odd question, but I've just finished rereading one of my favourite book on war reporting, which is Philip Knightley's book, The First Casualty. And he wrote that in the late 70s and seemed to be despairing about the way war reporting was being controlled. And I'm wondering if you had to pick a particular war, which would have been the best one to report on, given what journalists were capable of reporting on. From the freedom, maybe you want to go first, John. I think in Vietnam, for example, there's almost complete freedom to report whatever you liked. There was obviously censorship in other wars. Which is the best model?
Well, I spent quite a bit of my career reporting conflicts in the Middle East, and over a 10-year period. Of course, the nature of war has changed dramatically, and it's become a bit more like a video game now, and reporters, of course, are far removed from the action. For the most part, although you might say, reporters who are covering the Syrian conflict have got altogether too close to the action. So the nature of war reporting has changed dramatically over the years. In the case of Moorhead and others, they were located with field commanders, Moorhead and Alamein, of course, in the Western Desert. And but these days, you tend to find yourself, quite a long way away from the action, and I think it's frustrating, obviously, but you don't get such a flavour of what is going, what is happening. So I'm a bit envious, if you can be envious of your predecessors who've covered wars in the past, that they got closer to the real thing.
Do you feel there's going to be any change in the nature of reporting now for all of us in the wake of what's happening in Syria, where there is, particularly the Middle East, you'll have seen the front line quite often disappear. But now in Syria, it is the first time that I can think of. AFP, the French press agency, put an excellent article a few weeks ago where they explained why they're not sending any journalists to Syria and why they actually won't use any freelance journalists in Syria, because they don't want to be seen as encouraging people to go. They have their own duty of care, and I can't think of a journalist who's operating in Syria now. That to me is something to despair about as a journalist, let alone as a human being.
Well, yes, choosing a war to report on is an odd question. I don't know that. I think the Second World War guys were pretty enthusiastic about getting there and telling the story. Today, I think in this book, I had a book a few years ago. I had an exhibition about war correspondence here at the Shrine five years ago. And there was sort of a book that came out, it was called Eyewitness Australians Right from the Front Line. So they're not just war correspondents, but other people as well. And there's a chapter, there's a section at the end of it called The Front Line Today. We're all on the front line today to some extent. I thought I got on the front line in the 90s, the middle 90s, where I was on an aeroplane in Egypt and managed to get myself hijacked. Met Colonel Gaddafi and, set me free, luckily. But, if you're in Bali or, all the things that are going on, the front line is, all around us, I think. So that's another thing to do. But I guess if I had my own choice, I'd be with the heroes. I'd be in World War II.
As someone who's reported on war, Mark, would you have a preference where you could have been?
None of them. I think the big thing today that's changed, that's had a huge impact on the covering of war by journalists, is that whereas over many years there was sometimes a very high degree of immunity, a recognition that journalists were non-partisan, were there doing a job, were not, even if they might have come from a particular nationality or side, were there to report it in an impartial way, and that gave them a degree of protection. Sometimes you wouldn't want to trust it too far, but I think to the extent that did exist in the past, I think it's vanished completely now. So that is why, in part, people are not going to report the situation in Syria, because it's a passport to be kidnapped or killed, and there is no protection in that regard for your status as a journalist. And I think to some extent journalists have contributed to the destruction of that by playing partisan games. And my experience in Afghanistan some years ago, being horrified to discover that the correspondent for Fox News was carrying a firearm into Afghanistan. I thought, he's a clown. He's a very famous and very rich clown now, but this guy, to the extent that it gets around that you're carrying a gun and you're prepared to use it, well, you're a target too.
Geraldo Rivera, possibly?
Yes, quite right.
He's a famous or infamous American correspondent who makes his stories about him rather than wars, for example. The cost on the journalists themselves, we're more aware of it now. Was it discussed much amongst the journalists you've been talking about? I'm thinking, for example, someone like Michael Ware, Australian correspondent who had enormous experience, terrifying experiences in Iraq, has spoken openly, particularly an Australian story, about the cost to him, post-traumatic stress, to such an extent he actually lost the ability to write. Was that ever talked about much amongst the sort of correspondence you're talking about from previous wars?
You want me to answer that question? I've never heard of post-traumatic stress disorder when I was, covering the Iraq War in '91, or the Iran-Iraq War in the preceding decade, or the Lebanon Civil War, or Sudanese Civil War or the Algerian Civil War or the Yemen Civil War. I suppose as a correspondent I thought, well, you know, this is what you did, and you took obviously calculated risks, and of course you were in often, or quite frequently, terrifying situations. I used to find that, you know, after a terrifying experience in Lebanon, for example, I would go to the bar of the Commodore Hotel and have a double vodka, and in fact more than a few double vodka. So not to diminish this issue of post-traumatic stress, I'm sure it does, and I noticed Sally Sarah admitted the other day that she had suffered from it. I was, like we're in the confessional here, but I experienced a very severe depression after the Gulf War, and this is an admission, a clinical depression. Now, it's entirely possible that this was what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't, of course, in those days it was not something that was diagnosed. So, yeah, I mean, it is true that people who find themselves in extreme danger over a period of time, it takes its toll. And I mean, particularly on servicemen who, you know, find themselves in the front line and take enormous risks, such as our, you know, troops in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So, I think it's. I know Peter Lay, General Peter Lay, former head of the army, is part of a charitable foundation that is trying to address this issue, and it's a real issue. I don't think we should diminish it.
I mean, if there was anyone who should have suffered from PTSD as a journalist, it was probably Charles Bean. Think of the things he saw. You know, he saw, you know, a good proportion of 61,000 Australians killed, and he lived with the number of soldiers who committed suicide after, who obviously suffered from, you know, what they called shell shock and all of those other things, and among the commanders, you know, Elliot and Mackay was another one, and there's quite a number of people who Hugo Throssell, for example. I mean, he said in the end, he said, my old warhead has gone fut, and shot himself. So among the soldiers, you know, the PTSD, what we call it, PTSD now, was tremendous. But being, I don't know, there must be something about the tremendous project he was on, both reporting and, you know, and then 20 or 30 years of writing the histories and editing and so on, that and I guess he had a, you know, when people then had a religious foundation that maybe we don't necessarily have today. There's other things about it, but I mean, he didn't seem to me, or, you know, from all the reading I've done of his work, to have suffered. And I think that may be, you know, that's the kind of the, you know, what Primo Levi and, you know, others that of course, you know, he was a witness to it, you know, and that was his job that he took on. Yeah.
Just one point there very quickly. Philip Knightley has been mentioned before this evening in his book First Casualty. He relates in that book. I mean, I think war correspondents have been, you know, a significant export by this country. And the question was asked of a British general, why do Australians make such good war correspondents? And his response was, because they're good at camping out.
In fact, Knightley argues in World War II, Australians really led the way. We were quite formative in that art of being a war correspondent. I'll just, if anyone's got any questions, if you want to pop your hand up, we'll got just a few minutes to answer some questions while you've got this esteemed line up here.
Hi, my question relates, I guess, in part to what you were saying about stringers and locals who are trying to sort of do citizen journalism in their own places, and the fact that a lot of news organisations now won't use their content because there's fear that they're putting themselves at risk. There's been a lot of discussion in Australia recently about the surveillance society and some of the technology that we're getting. I'm just wondering whether you've given any thought to the use of things like drones to give visual access to war zones and to increase people's safety, and whether some of that new technology could be deployed in conflict situations.
A pilotless journalist, that would be good.
Editors would love it. The only, it's an interesting issue. I suspect it has been thought about. I work in television. You reckon television would be the first to think about sending up a camera to fly over a war zone. Would also create a tremendous target for both sides, or all sides in any conflict. So I'm not sure at a practical level what it would achieve. And secondly, getting a drone into a country would probably be about as easy as getting a warhead in. I'm not sure. It's an interesting idea. I'm just not sure about the practicalities of it.
It's a good question, because it's a question that has to do with technology, and it reflects, of course, the unbelievable changes in technology that have taken place over the years. Early correspondents would maybe send their dispatches by pigeon post, Morse code. But can you imagine Charles Bean in Gallipoli getting his copy back to his newspapers back in Australia, if he could get them past the censor? It was a very laborious, very cumbersome process. When I started in my business as a foreign correspondent back in the 70s in China, communications were really a problem. Telephone lines were terrible, and Mark succeeded me not immediately, but by one, right, in Beijing, and I think it improved somewhat since then. But they were tapping our phones so heavily with very old-fashioned Soviet type listening equipment that they drained so much power off that you couldn't, and you had to wait for a long time to make a phone call. But then things of course evolved. But what really brought home to me the power of new technology and satellite telephones and all the other things was the first Gulf War, when CNN, of course, had satellite technology, and they were covering the war live from Baghdad. And we had an association. I worked for the Financial Times in those days with CNN. I used to see them on camera live from Baghdad as cruise missiles were sort of, making a right-hand turn, in the street outside. So the correspondents like Moorhead and Noel Monks and others, couldn't possibly imagine how far and how fast we've come as far as technology is concerned. And of course what it does is makes a correspondent in the field much more self-contained, because they don't have to rely on, phone networks or the other, or more traditional means of communicating. And the first question we'd always ask when we got to a particular location of each other is, how are you going to file? How are we going to file? Who are we going to bribe? And one thing that foreign correspondents, I think, and war correspondents pride themselves on is never missing a deadline. Whatever the circumstances, well, I missed a few. When Reagan bombed Tripoli, Gaddafi just shut down the phone system, so that was it. We were trapped in Tripoli and no means of communication and no satellite phones in those days. And then I recall covering the funeral of Ayatollah Khomeini, and there was one telephone international line in our hotel, and it had been commandeered by the Turks. The Anatolian news agency was gramming photographs, and that's a very slow process. Anyway, I could see the minutes slipping away, and I was going to miss the deadline. I had. So I paid the telephone operator $100 to pull the plug on the Anatolian news agency, and slipped into the cubicle and began dictating my copy before they realised that it was banging on the it was a stupid story.
There's a great book written about how bribery has been used by correspondents. in many great stories.
Chester Wilmot, when he was reporting for, you've turned it off, Tony.
Oh,
I think
sorry.
that's all right. That's good. Chester Wilmot, when he was reporting for the ABC in Greece and North Africa in the Second World War, they had a truck, a recording truck. Like, I don't know what it was. It couldn't have been a Holden. Must have been a something.
Sure.
Looked like a little Austin.
With a little Austin, yeah, and it had, and they used to record what you'd hear on the ABC. This is an actuality, or no, that's the wrong voice. This is an actuality broadcast from Chester Wilmot in northern Greece, and there's a fantastic one called "Blowing Up the Road," where the Australians are retreating, withdrawing down the yeah, thing, and they had to blow. They were blowing. The engineers were blowing up bridges and stuff. So you can hear Chester saying, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And they had that strange
Crackling.
voice, you know, the Australian, English modified voice. What are you going to do? Oh, well, I'm going to blow up the. Boom! You'd hear and it go boom. And they took this thing. They took the truck into Tobruk as well. So he went in, you know, and that's and he was recording on these steel, you know, like LP records, great big steel things like this. And then they got them back to Australia somehow, and they were broadcast actuality broadcast from Chester Wilmot.
The things have changed when Pete Stefanovic, my colleague from Nine, was in Tahrir Square last year, the year before, had the camera equipment confiscated, sound gear, tapes, discs all stolen. We still managed to file on an iPhone and virtually a live report. So the speed at which you get stuff out now is faster than ever. I'd like to take more time for questions, but I don't want to intrude too much on what limited time we've got out in the galleries. Maybe just a quick one.
Just a very brief opportunity for Tony, I think, to tell about the most ingenious of all correspondents getting the news out. Chinese Morrison and tennis balls.
That's obviously a very large gap in my my chapter. Maybe you'd like to tell the story.
As I understand it, Chinese Morrison, during the siege of Peking, he was a correspondent for the Times, as you know, and he would file his copy inside tennis balls, which he'd throw over the walls. So this is recorded in the book written on Chinese Morrison.
Yeah.
So it's not.
It's in Cyril Pearl's book, is it? I don't recall that. We're revising the book. We'll have to include the tennis balls. One thing that came to light when I was researching these chapters, I didn't write the Damien Parra chapter. I'm not sure who did.
David Parra did.
Yeah. But Missy Higgins, the singer, is directly related to Damien Parra and George Morrison on mother and father's side. So there you are. There's a pedigree.
Just one more quick question.
Talking about technology in the context of social media and citizen reporting. Today we get a whole host of streams coming to us, and the news outlets are using a lot of that content.
Yep.
I'd be interested in your comments in the context of where the war reporter stands in that, in the sense of all of that information coming into the system, and how you take what you need or what you leave out and reject, and how you make those decisions.
Speaking person, I think you already gave the answer to that. Context. Someone's got to synthesise all that and give it context and give it some sort of broader meaning. Tony?
Yes, I mean the obvious recent example, of course, of the power of social media, and we can't deny it. I mean, and in our own business, journalists here would say, I mean, you know, the power of Twitter, the power of Facebook, it's remarkable, isn't it? Remarkable. I never thought that I would Twitter, but I do, you know, sparingly and never when I'm drunk or angry. There's not much of the time. But in of course, the Arab Spring and other, you know, such citizens' movements, and of course also in Syria, social media has been an enormously powerful tool, and it has changed the nature of reporting, and it's citizen journalism. And, I think that's fantastic. But of course, the challenge for newspapers, media organisations, whether television or newspapers, is to synthesise and make use of that material in a way that makes it understandable to the audience.
So journalism used to be the first draft of history, now it's Twitter. That might be a good point to leave it, because we have a limited amount of time to go and explore this magnificent development here. So thank you for indulging us, and I think it's been a fascinating conversation. So gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you.